It was New Year's Eve, 2019, and I was driving home from spending the holidays with my family in central Pennsylvania. The trip was supposed to be simple, a 3-hour drive through backcountry highways, quiet and serene. I'd planned to get back home, open a bottle of wine, and watch the fireworks from my apartment window. But nature had other plans. The snow started falling lightly just as I left the town limits, dusting the roads in white. It was beautiful at first, the kind of snowfall that makes you feel like you're in a postcard. But within an hour, the storm worsened. The flakes turned to sheets of ice, and the wind howled like a living thing. Visibility dropped to nearly zero, and I realized I had no choice but to pull over. I found a small clearing at the side of the highway, barely wide enough to fit my car. The storm raged around me, the wind rocking the vehicle as snow piled up on the windshield. My phone had no signal, so I decided to wait it out, hoping the storm would let up before too long. I'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes when I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me, maybe it was a snowplow, or another traveler who could help me find a safe way out. The vehicle, an old pickup truck, pulled up beside me. Its hazard lights flashed orange in the swirling whiteout. The driver rolled down his window, revealing an older man bundled in a thick coat and hat. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his beard was streaked with gray. "You all right there?" he called out, his voice gruff but kind. I rolled my window down just enough to respond. "The storm's too heavy. I can't drive in this." He nodded, glancing at my small sedan. "You won't get far in that car. Storm's only gonna get worse. I can take you into town, there's a motel a few miles up." The thought of sitting in my freezing car all night was unbearable, so I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and climbed into his truck. The warmth of the cab was a welcome relief, and the man even offered me a cup of coffee from a thermos he had in the console. "Name's Gary," he said, his tone friendly. "Been driving these roads for years. Storms like this don't faze me." I introduced myself and thanked him for the ride. For the first few minutes, I felt safe, even grateful. But as the truck veered away from the highway, I started to feel uneasy. Gary wasn't heading toward town. At first, I thought I was mistaken, that he was taking a back road or a shortcut. But as the minutes passed, the truck moved deeper into the countryside. The faint glow of the town lights disappeared behind us, swallowed by the storm. "This doesn't seem like the way to the motel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Gary glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "It's a shortcut," he said curtly. Something about his tone made my stomach churn. I glanced at my phone, but it still had no service. The snow outside grew heavier, muffling the world beyond the cab. Everything looked the same, dark trees, endless snow, and no sign of civilization. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked again, my voice more insistent. Gary didn't answer. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. Panic set in. I gripped the door handle, my heart racing. "Stop the truck," I said firmly. Gary didn't respond. The truck slowed as we reached a narrow, snow-covered trail, the headlights illuminating the dense woods on either side. The path was unmarked, leading who knows where. "Stop the truck," I shouted. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the icy road. He turned to me, his expression calm but cold. "You want to get out?" "Fine." The way he looked at me made me hesitate, but staying in the truck felt worse. I grabbed my bag and opened the door, the cold wind hitting me like a wall. "You won't make it far out there," Gary said, his voice almost mocking. I didn't answer. I stepped out into the storm, the snow stinging my face as I trudged forward. The sound of the truck's engine faded behind me, replaced by the eerie silence of the blizzard. I walked for what felt like hours, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The storm was disorienting, turning the landscape into a swirling void. My breath fogged in the freezing air, and my legs ached with every step. And then, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the wind. But they grew louder, deliberate and heavy, matching my pace. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped too. I turned, but the storm obscured everything. The darkness between the trees felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. I started walking faster, my heart pounding. The footsteps followed, never gaining, never falling behind. Panic gripped me as I stumbled through the snow, desperate to find shelter. Finally, I saw it, a faint light in the distance. A house. I stumbled toward it, my legs numb and my lungs burning. When I reached the porch, I pounded on the door, my fists raw from the cold. The door opened, and a man stood there, his face etched with concern. "Please," I gasped. "Someone's following me." He pulled me inside, locking the door behind me. His wife appeared, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders as I tried to explain what had happened. But when we looked outside, the snow was untouched. No footprints, no truck. Just the empty, frozen night. I never saw Gary, or whatever was following me, again. To this day, I don't know what I experienced out there. But every New Year's Eve, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls, I remember the sound of those footsteps. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to stray too far. New Year's Eve, 2020, was supposed to be a night to remember. My friends and I had planned to attend a big celebration in the heart of downtown Chicago, complete with fireworks, music, and champagne. But a freak snowstorm shut down most of the city's public transportation, and our plans unraveled. My best friend, Dan, came up with a last-minute idea. "There's an old station outside the city," he said. "It's abandoned now, but people say it's got this eerie vibe. We could go check it out, have our own little New Year's adventure." It was the kind of idea that felt ridiculous and fun at the same time, until it wasn't. The station was in a small, forgotten suburb about an hour's drive from the city. We piled into Dan's car, along with his girlfriend, Lily, and my cousin, Jess. Snow blanketed the roads, making the drive slow and treacherous. By the time we arrived, the storm had eased, leaving the world coated in a thick, pristine white. The station loomed before us, its dark silhouette stark against the snowy landscape. It was a relic from the early 1900s, its brick walls crumbling and its windows broken. A faded sign above the entrance read, "Willow Grove Station." "I can't believe we're doing this," Jess said, shivering as we climbed out of the car. "It's just for fun," Dan said, pulling out his flashlight. "We'll explore for a bit, take some pictures, and head back before midnight." The air was bitterly cold, and the wind carried an eerie silence as we approached the building. The station's wooden doors were ajar, creaking faintly as they swayed in the wind. Inside, the station was even more unsettling. The main hall was cavernous, its high ceiling shrouded in shadows. Broken benches were scattered across the floor, along with piles of snow that had blown in through the shattered windows. A massive clock hung on the far wall, its hands frozen at 11:45. "Creepy," Lily said, snapping a photo with her phone. Dan grinned. Exactly what we were going for. We split up to explore, each of us armed with a flashlight. Jess and I stuck together, making our way toward the ticket booth at the back of the hall. The wooden counter was covered in dust, and old, yellowed tickets were still tucked into the drawers. "This place is like a time capsule," Jess said, her breath fogging in the cold air. I nodded, running my fingers over the worn surface of the counter. But something about the station felt off, as if we weren't alone. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to echo through the hall. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking something loose, but the rhythm was too deliberate. "Do you hear that?" Jess whispered. I nodded, shining my flashlight toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the far end of the hall, near the stairwell that led to the lower platforms. "Let's check it out," Jess said, though her voice wavered. Reluctantly, I followed her toward the stairs. The tapping grew louder as we descended, echoing off the damp, graffiti-covered walls. The air grew colder, and the smell of mildew was replaced by something metallic, like rust or blood. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves on a long, narrow platform. The tracks were covered in snow, and the tunnel beyond was pitch black. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, its faint light casting long shadows across the platform. "Who would leave a lantern here?" Jess muttered. Before I could respond, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Then, from the darkness of the tunnel, we heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached. I grabbed Jess's arm, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam revealed nothing but empty tracks and swirling snow. Dan. Jess called out, her voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. We turned to head back up the stairs, but the lantern above us flickered and went out, plunging the platform into darkness. A low, guttural whisper echoed through the tunnel, a language I couldn't understand. "Run," I whispered, pulling Jess toward the stairs. We burst back into the main hall, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Dan and Lily were waiting for us, their faces pale. "Did you hear it?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Before we could answer, the tapping started again, this time coming from the ceiling. We all looked up, our flashlights converging on the massive clock. Its hands were moving, ticking slowly backward. "This isn't funny," Dan said, his bravado fading. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if something was pounding on the other side of the ceiling. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the corners of the hall seemed to shift and writhe. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice tight. We ran for the doors, but they slammed shut before we could reach them. The sound echoed through the hall, followed by the same low whispering we'd heard on the platform. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. Then, from the shadows, they appeared. Figures began to materialize, tall and thin, their forms flickering like static on an old television. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. They moved toward us slowly, their movements jerky and unnatural. Dan grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor, wielding it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted. The figures didn't stop. We huddled together, backing toward the ticket booth. The whispering grew louder, the figures closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on us. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The whispering ceased, the figures disappeared, and the hall was silent once more. The doors creaked open, revealing the snow-covered parking lot beyond. We didn't wait to question it. We ran to the car and sped away, the station disappearing into the storm behind us. None of us have spoken about that night since, and we've never gone back to Willow Grove Station. But every New Year's Eve, I think about the tapping, the whispering, and the figures in the shadows. And I wonder if they're still there, waiting for someone else to come looking for an adventure. New Year's Eve, 2017, was supposed to be an adventure. My boyfriend, Caleb, had heard about a supposedly haunted mine in a remote part of West Virginia, Black Hollow Mine. It had been abandoned for decades, left to crumble into the mountainside after a series of mysterious disappearances. Caleb loved anything to do with the paranormal, and he convinced me to check it out with him and his brother, Ryan. I wasn't thrilled about spending the night in the middle of nowhere, but Caleb assured me it would be fun. "It's just for a few hours," he said, grinning. "We'll explore a bit, take some photos, and head back to town before midnight." I should have trusted my gut. By the time the clock struck 12, I wished we'd never gone near that place. We arrived at the mine just after sunset. The drive had been treacherous, the narrow dirt road winding through dense woods and sheer drops. By the time we parked Caleb's truck, the air was icy, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon. The entrance to the mine was overgrown with vines and framed by jagged rocks. A rusted sign hung crookedly above the opening, the words barely legible, "Danger, do not enter." "This is going to be awesome," Caleb said, pulling out a flashlight. Ryan followed him eagerly, but I hesitated, staring into the yawning darkness of the mine. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic. The walls were lined with crumbling wooden beams, and the floor was littered with debris, rusted tools, broken lanterns, and old mining carts that had been left to decay. Caleb led the way, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Ryan snapped photos with his phone, the flash illuminating the narrow tunnel in brief, blinding bursts. "Creepy, right?" Caleb said, his voice echoing against the stone walls. I didn't respond. Something about the mine felt wrong, like the air itself was pressing down on us. And then, from somewhere deep in the tunnel, we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. We froze, the sound reverberating through the mine. At first, I thought it might be water dripping from the ceiling, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too steady. "Probably just an animal," Caleb said, though his voice was less confident now. Ryan shone his flashlight down the tunnel, but the beam only revealed more darkness. The tapping stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. "Let's keep going," Caleb said, motioning for us to follow. I wanted to turn back, but I didn't want to be the one to ruin the adventure. Reluctantly, I walked deeper into the mine. The tunnels grew narrower as we descended, the walls slick with moisture. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of metal became stronger. Caleb stopped suddenly, his flashlight illuminating a wooden door set into the rock wall. "What is this doing here?" he muttered, running his hand over the door's surface. It was old and warped, the wood splintered and rotting. There was no handle, just a rusted keyhole that seemed out of place in such a crude setting. Ryan stepped closer, snapping a photo. The flash lit up the tunnel, and for a split second, I thought I saw something behind us, a shadow that didn't belong to any of us. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "See what?" Caleb asked, turning around. I shone my flashlight down the tunnel, but it was empty. The shadows danced with the movement of the light, but there was nothing there. "Probably just your imagination," Caleb said, though he didn't sound convinced. We moved past the door and continued deeper into the mine. The air grew colder still, and the tapping sound returned, louder and more insistent. It echoed off the walls, surrounding us, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "Okay, this is getting weird," Ryan said, his bravado slipping. "Maybe we should head back." Caleb hesitated, torn between curiosity and common sense. "Let's just see what's down this last tunnel," he said. "Then we'll leave." The tunnel ended in a small chamber, its walls carved roughly from the rock. In the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in tools and scraps of paper so old they crumbled at the slightest touch. On the far wall, a series of symbols had been scratched into the stone, circles, lines, and shapes I didn't recognize. "What the hell is this?" Ryan muttered, snapping another photo. The tapping grew louder, almost deafening now, and the air seemed to vibrate with it. The symbols on the wall seemed to shimmer, as if they were alive. And then, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, and I felt panic rise in my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam barely penetrated the blackness. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whispering that seemed to come from all around us. "Caleb," I called out, my voice shaking. "I'm here," he said, his voice tight. "Stay close." The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I felt something brush against my arm, cold and wet, like a clammy hand, and I screamed. "Run!" Caleb shouted, grabbing my hand and pulling me back toward the tunnel. We stumbled through the darkness, the whispering chasing us like a living thing. I could hear Ryan behind us, his breathing ragged, but I didn't dare look back. The shadows seemed to close in, and I felt like the walls were alive, shifting and twisting as we ran. When we reached the wooden door, it was open. Beyond the door was another chamber, this one larger and more elaborate. The walls were lined with rotting wooden shelves, each one filled with jars of murky liquid. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface stained dark with something that looked like rust, or blood. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. It raised one hand, pointing directly at us. "Run!" Caleb shouted again, and we bolted back the way we had come. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out, the air growing colder with every step. The tapping sound returned, louder and faster, as if whatever was behind us was gaining. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. When we finally burst out of the mine, the cold night air hit me like a wall. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck, collapsing inside and locking the doors. We drove back to town in silence, too shaken to speak. The tapping sound echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been followed. The next day, Caleb and Ryan wanted to go back for their equipment, but when we returned to the trailhead, the mine entrance was gone. To this day, I don't know what we saw in Black Hollow Mine. But every New Year's Eve, I hear the faint tapping in my dreams, and I see the hooded figure standing in the shadows. And I wonder if it's still waiting, deep in the darkness. New Year's Eve, 2018, was supposed to be simple. My sister, Natalie, and I had planned a quiet night at our family's cabin in northern Michigan. The cabin was our go-to retreat, nestled deep in the woods and far from the noise of the city. We figured we'd spend the night making s'mores by the fire, counting down to midnight with mugs of hot cocoa. But as the sun set, the peaceful stillness of the forest began to feel oppressive. By the time midnight came, I would wish we had never gone there. The day had been uneventful. We arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, unloading our bags and starting a fire in the wood stove. Snow was falling steadily, blanketing the trees in white and muffling every sound. It was picturesque, the kind of setting you'd see on a holiday postcard. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The wind picked up, rattling the old windows and sending drafts through the cabin. We huddled under blankets in the living room, the fire crackling as we watched an old movie on DVD. Everything seemed normal, until the lights went out. At first, we thought it was just the storm. The cabin's power often went out during heavy snow, and we were prepared with flashlights and candles. I lit a few candles and placed them around the room, their flickering light casting shadows on the walls. "It's fine," I said, trying to reassure Natalie. "The power will probably come back soon." But deep down, I felt uneasy. The woods outside were too quiet, the silence pressing against the cabin like a weight. And then, from somewhere in the distance, we heard it. A faint knocking sound. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind. Natalie and I froze, our eyes meeting in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The knocking came again, louder this time, deliberate and rhythmic. It was coming from the back door. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept toward the door, Natalie close behind me. The knocking stopped just as I reached the handle. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. The porch was empty. Snow covered the steps, untouched by footprints. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything, that could have made the noise. "See? It's nothing," I said, trying to sound casual. But the uneasy feeling lingered as I shut the door and locked it. An hour later, the knocking returned. This time, it came from the front door. Louder, more insistent, echoing through the cabin. Natalie clutched my arm, her face pale. "What if it's someone who needs help?" she said. I grabbed the flashlight again and moved to the front door, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. I opened the door just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam illuminated the porch, the snow-covered yard, and the edge of the woods beyond. There was no one there. But something caught my eye, a faint light, flickering between the trees. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from a distant house or car. But as I stared, I realized the light was moving, swaying gently like a lantern carried by an unseen hand. "Do you see that?" Natalie whispered, peering over my shoulder. I nodded, my unease deepening. The light was mesmerizing, drawing my gaze despite the fear clawing at my chest. "I think we should stay inside," I said, shutting the door and locking it again. The light didn't go away. It hovered at the edge of the woods, swaying back and forth as if waiting for us. We tried to ignore it, but the longer it stayed, the harder it was to pretend it wasn't there. By 11 p.m., the light had moved closer. Natalie was the first to notice. "It's coming toward the cabin," she said, her voice trembling. The light was no longer at the edge of the woods. It was in the yard now, moving slowly but steadily toward the porch. I grabbed a fireplace poker, holding it like a weapon as we backed away from the windows. The knocking started again, louder than before, echoing through the cabin. The light outside grew brighter, casting long shadows across the snow. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint, rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The light outside flared, blindingly bright for a moment, before disappearing completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. Natalie and I stayed awake, too afraid to sleep. The power didn't come back, and the cabin felt colder with each passing hour. Every creak of the old wood and every gust of wind made us jump, our nerves fraying. At midnight, the light returned. This time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the cabin. It started as a faint glow in the corner of the living room, barely visible in the darkness. But it grew brighter, taking on a shape, a tall, thin figure, its features obscured by the blinding light. Natalie screamed, and I swung the poker, but it passed through the figure as if it wasn't there. The light pulsed, filling the room with an unnatural heat, and the tapping sound returned, louder and more insistent. We ran. I grabbed Natalie's hand, and we bolted out the front door into the freezing night. The snow was deep, and the wind stung our faces, but we didn't stop running until we reached the road. When we looked back, the cabin was dark. The light was gone, and the woods were silent. We spent the rest of the night in the car, huddled together for warmth. When the sun rose, we drove back to the cabin to gather our things, but something had changed. The air around the cabin felt heavy, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were watching us. We didn't stay long. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The light was back, flickering between the trees, watching us leave. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. Natalie refuses to talk about it, and I've avoided the cabin ever since. But every New Year's Eve, I think about that light, that figure, and the way it seemed to follow us. And I wonder if it's still waiting, ready to appear for someone else.